of 115, or just 3.8%, but again, really a tale of two trends, a significant reduction during the tail end of the recession and a significant increase. You can see the increases down below, 8.3% using the preliminary 2013 data, but even 6% using the 2014 data as well. And just looking back the last 5 years, you've had the second highest average annual job growth in the county for the cities. At 4.4%, Ridgefield was at 6.6. So that sets up the trends. We use those trends to help inform the forecast. We also use the Clark County forecast for employment. And this was developed in mid-2014 by Scott Bailey with the Employment Security Department. Some of you heard Scott Monday at the Employment Forecast Breakfast. I haven't had a chance to ask him if his forecast would be rosier today than it was in mid-2014, but these are the numbers he put together for the county's comp plan update. So if you look at their total non-farm employment, they're at roughly 153,000 in September of, that was June of 2015, and he's forecasting a total of 219,800 jobs in 2035, which is the end of that 20-year planning horizon. 67,000 jobs, roughly, 44% increase, 1.8% increase annually on the average. And that compares to the prior 20 years, where there was a 2.3% average annual growth. If you're in fact able to, if the county is in fact able to achieve that job growth, the jobs per occupied household will just be over 1 at 1.01. So it's just, you can compare that to where you are today. Today they're at 0.92. We told you you were at 0.55, and the county would be at 1.0, a little over 1.0 in 2035. I'll show you the forecasts for you in a minute.
Could I ask you a question?
Please.
On employment by major sector up here, is that just the city of Washougal, or are you counting the ports industrial area?
It includes the ports industrial area because that's included in the city of Washougal's city limits, yes.
Thank you.
Okay? So the same kind of breakdown for the county on slide 8 at the bottom. You can see 77% currently commercial sectors, 23% industrial sectors. And the growth is going to be just slightly more concentrated in the commercial sector. If you look at Scott's forecast, he's got 78% of that growth coming in the commercial sectors and 22% of that coming in the industrial sectors. So fairly balanced growth forecast over the next 20 years, keeping that ratio consistent. Okay? So then we use that information to construct some Washougal forecast scenarios to compare ultimately against the land capacity. And we developed 3 scenarios here. Scenario A essentially is the status quo. Take that 0.55 jobs per household and assume that it continues over the next 20 years. So for every new household you get 0.55 new jobs. And it just grows at the same pace as population, which is 2% per year. Your population forecast has you at 22,510 in 2035, which is roughly a 2% annual increase over today's population, and this just fixes that employment growth at the same pace. Scenario B takes a little bit more aggressive stance in terms of the job growth, adding 0.75 new jobs per new household. That increases roughly just over 2,000 jobs over that 20-year horizon, about 100 new jobs per year, or a growth rate of 2.6%. Again, if you compare that to the 2.0% in scenario A and your population growth. Scenario C targets the new job growth at 1 job per new household. And you can see that's a 2,757 new jobs, 88% increase in annual growth rate of 3.2%. So 3 different scenarios. The scenario A keeps you at 0.55. Scenario B, you'll end up at 0.61 jobs per household. And in scenario C, you'd end up at 0.70 jobs per household at the end of that 20-year forecast. Okay.
Do you have any idea which of these is going to bear out?
I can give you some historical data to compare that to, which I will.
Because as I understand, is it coming up?
Yes.
Okay, I'll defer.
So this translates those, the forecast scenarios, this is slide 10, translates those forecast scenarios into actual jobs, and then translates those jobs into land demand using the same variables that the county uses in their vacant buildable lands model in their comp plan process. So you can see the three different scenarios, A, B, and C, the different average annual growth rates in terms of employment. And that translates into 1,500 jobs in scenario A, 2,000 in scenario B, and almost 2,800 in scenario C. And you can see the split between the commercial and industrial jobs. I'm using 75%, 25%, partly to take advantage of the county's job forecast, but also recognizing that you have a fairly strong industrial jobs base. That land supply is somewhat limited and is expected not to be increased in terms of the port of Camas-Washougal industrial land. So I take those the three job forecast scenarios, the employment forecast scenarios, and translate those into land requirements using 20 jobs per acre for the commercial side, 9 jobs per acre for the industrial side, and you can see the land requirements to meet that 99 acres under scenario A, 135 under scenario B, and 180 under scenario C. Okay? And Councilmember Boger, this is where I can provide you some historical context and some other comparisons for those forecast scenarios. This slide shows you the historical data for the city of Washougal, and wanted to show you both the 2014 data, which is not preliminary, and then also use the 2015 preliminary data. So this is a 20-year growth trend. 1.2% has been the average annual increase using the 2014 actual employment data. Using the 2015 preliminary, it's 1.4%, recognizing that big increase you had in 2015. And you can see the three forecast scenarios in the middle, how they compare to the historical. And then I show you the county's forecast employment growth at 1.8% per year, and the population growth for Washougal at 2.0%. What I don't show you here is your historical population growth, which has actually been 5.1% per year. So you've had very fast, so we talked about that 60% growth over that 10-year time frame from 2000 to 2010, but your employment growth has averaged 5%, just over 5% a year. Okay? So then we compare that. We need to we need to understand what the land capacity is, and we use the county's vacant buildable lands model data to do this. We got a download of their data for every parcel in Washougal, and we analyzed it and identified the following information for the Northeast and the Northwest UGA. And as Scott mentioned, the Northeast UGA is just under 400 acres. The Northwest is just around 600, just under 600 acres. You can see the critical acres that each of those areas had, so fairly significant amounts of critical acres because of the topography. And then the net developable of 171 acres and 236 acres. That works out to be about 73% of the gross acres for the Northeast and about 61% of the gross acres for the Northwest, average of 43%. And you can see how that acreage breaks out into the different residential and land uses versus, via the comp plan designations. So you've got roughly 128 acres of employment land in the Northeast, 99 acres in the Northwest, with the balance being employment land of that 236. Okay? So a total of roughly 227 acres of employment land and 180 acres of residential. That's about 56% employment and 44% residential. Okay? So now we sort of roll all that together and do the net acres and capacities by location. And so just to orient you to this slide, we've included the city of Washougal, the Northeast UGA, the Northwest UGA, and other aspects of the UGA, and show you the total net buildable acres by land use. So there's the 255 acres in Washougal for residential land, 56 acres for commercial, 63 acres for industrial. And if you move down to the to the bottom half of this, you'll see the population and employment capacity. So that 255 acres translates into 4,196 people at an occupancy ratio. I actually used 2.74 people per household for Washougal. The vacant buildable lands model uses a 2.66. You've run a little bit higher than the county average. And then you can see the commercial job capacity and the industrial job capacity for Washougal there as well. So So roughly 1,700 jobs capacity inside the current city limits, and roughly 4,200 additional population. And you can see for the northeast and northwest and the other UGA, the UGA area outside those two major areas, 128 acres of employment land, the 99, that's from the prior page, and you can see that translates into 1,400 jobs and 976 jobs. The residential land at 700 people and just over 2,200 people in the northwest UGA. Okay, so I was walking you through the step-by-step. So now we can compare the forecast demand and the capacity for each of these locations. So in this chart, I want to back up just a minute and talk a little bit, actually I'll do it on this slide, talk a little bit about how the county calculates their job and employment capacity. So it's they take the vacant buildable lands in both the commercial and industrial sectors. And as I mentioned, they multiply that by 9 jobs per acre for the industrial and 20 jobs per acre for commercial. But they don't take into account redevelopment. So for an acre to be judged vacant and buildable, they has to meet certain criteria in terms of the value of the property's building versus the land. If it's very low building land, they call it redevelopable and they'll count it as vacant. But if it's built out with a house and it's being occupied as a house, like much of the land is, it's not considered vacant. It'll continue as it's built out as a residence, even though it's maybe zoned employment. The other thing is that they take mixed-use land, like your town center zones, and they discount that. They assume 40% of that will be employment at commercial and 60% will be residential. And so that translates into roughly 8 jobs per gross acre for your town center zoned property, which is, if you compare that to the town square development, just under an acre, had over 100 jobs in that development for that acre. So you can see there's a pretty strong difference between what actually gets built and what the model can assume gets built. And it can work the other way too, but wanted to point out that there are some differences. For calculating your capacity, I took a couple of the parcels. I ended up spending some time with developers in the community, landowners in the community, and looked at both the Portland and the Parker's Landing site, and adjusted the vacant buildable lands model for what we might expect to actually happen on those sites, given the development plan that is in place for, or at least being proposed for the Parker's Landing site and recent development in the Camas Washougal Industrial Park. And so this employment scenario, you'll see these numbers are slightly higher than what you saw on the previous page, estimating capacity of 4,514 jobs, and that takes into account the additional capacity for the port industrial land and the Parker's Landing site. And so you can see, just to orient you this, the population capacity is roughly 7,835 people. The jobs capacity for all the scenarios is the 4,514. The next line down is the projected increase. So that's 7,340 people that you're anticipating with a population of 22,510. That means the capacity as the projected increase is roughly 107%. So you've got enough land in your city and your UGA to cover 107% of the expected population growth. If you go to the different employment scenarios, you can see the percentages there. So 298% of the projected employment capacity, or excuse me, the employment demand in scenario A. So that just takes that 4,514 and divides it by that 1,516, which is what the scenario A employment forecast results in. For scenario B, the same percentage is 218%, and for scenario C, it's 164%. The next line down, if you just take the city capacity alone and ignore the urban growth areas, you have capacity to house roughly 57% of the population growth that you're anticipating over the next 20 years, 134% of the employment growth under scenario A, 98% of the employment growth under scenario B, and 74% of the employment growth under scenario C. Okay?
And that city capacity does include the so far undeveloped Steigerwald Employment Center at the east end of
Correct.
the port.
It does. And in fact, I've adjusted that up slightly. It's all critical, so it's all considered wetland. And what the vacant buildable lands model does is it discounts that by 50%. So it cuts it back pretty well. And given their ability to develop that land in the past, I added to that based on some of the recent developments that they've had.
Yeah, they have a comp plan that's certainly much more than 50%.
Yes, so didn't want to, but wanted to adjust for that, so. Okay?
So Paul, if your city capacity is percent of the increase, if we stay with scenario A, we've got more than enough existing within the city now.
That's a qualitative judgment, it's a policy judgment, but that certainly 300%. Typically, and this is in Scott Bailey's forecast, over a 20-year horizon, if you couldn't change anything between now and 20 years, he in his memo to county staff suggested a 50% market. So if things were booming, you'd want to sort of err on the high side. I think, and Scott can probably frame this better for some other jurisdictions, but that planning, and Mitch can too, but that planning capacity, if you're going to be revisiting your plan periodically through that may be 50%, maybe a little too much, but in that 50% capacity, if things were to take off, you don't want to be left flat-footed. You have to allow yourself time to be able to react, and that time frame can be quite long.
The one punchline that's really telling here is, within our current city limits, without fairly dramatic policy changes in our zoning, we don't have capacity for the population. We need our UGAs to meet it.
Yeah.
Without some fairly dramatic changes in the policy. Now, this is just without any UGA. Like, this is, if we didn't even have any UGA, this is just city limits.
That bottom line is, yeah.
Existing-
Bottom line.
Does that include the annexation we're doing now?
No, it does not.
So,
That finalized on Friday.
okay.
Right, so that 57% would bump up to something else, but it's not gonna be 100%. So unless we dramatically densify our zoning policies for residential within the existing city limits, we have to have residential land up in those UGAs, and we can't do without it.
But on the other hand, we don't, it looks like, unless we get into scenario C, we have the capacity for our employment, commercial.
And that's what Paul was getting at. So look at scenario A, it's 134%. Remembering there's a number of assumptions that feed this, and there's a slide coming up, and I won't give that away, to talk about how we might even increase capacity within the city, existing city limits, to make these numbers a little higher. However, under scenario A, there's a 34% buffer for job-creating lands that exists already with no additional job-creating lands in the UGAs. That buffer's 34%. That might be an adequate buffer. It's a policy choice about what that should be, and you heard Paul elaborate on that a second ago. You go, and that basically assumes that the rate of growth of jobs and population will stay the same relative to each other, and that we will have 0.55 jobs for every household that we put in. That's a major assumption to make, right? That bookends one end. That middle one, we don't have enough. We barely don't have enough, and there's no buffer. But again, there might be some policy choices or changes that could be made within the existing city limits where that 98% might be a higher number. Certainly in scenario C, which is very aggressive, if we get that kind of job growth here, which would be a nice thing, we would run out of land within the existing city limits without some serious changes. Now, I think one of the things to consider with all of this is these BBLM, these countywide assumptions that are made for how many jobs per acre that you get. They're broad stroke. We're using 20 as the number
commercial.
for commercial. So for example, that means 20 jobs per acre in our town center.
Actually works out that their assumptions are 8 because it's mixed use.
Right. Okay, and that's relatively low relative to other commercials. So I think there might actually, depending upon, and if you were to talk to some property owners who have property in the town center, they might tell you that the level of employment will be more dense than that in what they see. And Paul gave one example of that, the town square. So You have to keep those assumptions in mind, and so when you look at these bottom line numbers, 134, 98, and 74, they are based on those assumptions, and so there's some wiggle room in that based upon what would really happen in the town center or what might really happen at the port. I think Paul was able to do more corrective work on the countywide assumptions at the port and at the waterfront than perhaps in the core. So I think a punchline here, and I don't want to get too far in front of it, but a punchline here is there's an opportunity here to step back in our prior comprehensive plan designations in the UGAs and say, do we need that much employment land up there? And it's a very rational and reasonable posture to take, that we could step back and revisit that. The conclusions here do not say we better not eliminate any of this employment center zoning or we're in trouble. They don't say that unless, you know, your scenario C or scenario C plus. And there may be some other ways to do that. And as the team gets further into the presentation, they'll talk about, you know, what the next steps would be to consider all of that.
One other consideration I'll throw out there before I finish this up, because there's just a couple slides, but you do have the ability to react a little bit. So, you know, 8% job growth this year, 6% last year. I mean, it's likely to level off, but I mean, there's been some good news recently. But literally, you're just now exceeding where you were back in 2007. So it's you've got a ways to go in terms of the job growth. But I like to be optimistic, so part of
How does
that.
that compare with I know you know, we hit 10% unemployment in 2008 or so. A lot of the decrease in unemployment, they say, is because people aren't in the labor market and there aren't so many participants in it. How does that compare nationally with the number of people employed in 2008 was X versus now, 2015 say, versus we do have a small, you know, what, about 10% increase roughly in employment?
And I haven't looked at it for Washougal, but you're now just getting back to where you were in terms of the jobs
We've actually
here.
exceeded it at this
Yeah,
point by
yeah.
about 10%.
Yeah, for the jobs here. For Clark County as a whole, just, you know, it wasn't until mid last year that you exceeded the employment here versus the jobs pre-recession. Looking at a different metric, which is the labor force, so the employed people that live here, that's another number. That's where you get the people that are no longer in the workforce, and that also just recently went past where it was. And I haven't looked at that for you, but in past presentations, that's, you know, one of the sticking points for the national economic policy is that job growth, getting people back into the workforce. So. The other dynamic is self-employed workers, which aren't necessarily in this. This is workers covered by unemployment insurance. I did look at that for you. You've actually had a nice uptick in your self-employed population, so that also is contributing, I think, to some of your economic growth as well. So I just want to hit on the last couple of slides and then turn it over to you for discussion. This slide 15 takes scenario B and just runs it out. I did want to also go back 20 years and forward 20 years, and there was a point where you were above 1. Back in 1995, there was an annexation, I think, in 97 that took you below 1, and then with the rapid population growth in the 2000s, you can see where that line fell pretty precipitously. But if population grows from the 15,170 to the 22,510, and employment grows from the 3120 to the 5187 as scenario B, you'd have 0.61 jobs per household at the end of the forecast period. And you can see how that compares to recent trends.
Well, before you leave that slide,
Still got it.
a question. That drop to 0.55, is part of that between 2005 and 2010 the number of retired people who came up here?
No, I think your population growth, I don't know what the demographics are for your population growth, whether that included a large proportion of retirees. I can tell you about the employment declines, which I think is the bigger contributor to that. I mean, it was a combination. You had 33% drop in your industrial employment over a time period where your population was growing fairly rapidly over that time period, 5% a year. So it was the combination of the recession, but you still capturing household growth inside the city limits.
Thanks.
So this is a graph, and I think complements the points that City Administrator Scott was making a minute ago. So let me just orient you to this. This is the employment, the left side of this graph are the employment annual growth rates. The blue portion is the historical growth rate, that 1.4% average annual growth rate over the last 20 years. The 2.6 is scenario B's forecasted growth rate. And then the green portion is the growth rate that you'd have to consume all of the capacity that you have, all of the employment land capacity. So that's a 4.5% average annual growth rate.
All
Okay.
the current capacity?
Including the UGA.
Okay.
So all of the current capacity in your urban growth area and your city. Okay? And the same blue, red, green on the population side, which is the right-hand side. Historically, you grew at 5.1% a year. The population forecast has you at just under 2%. That 2%, I'd take it out to another digit. And to consume all of your land capacity in the city and the UGA, you will 2.11% average annual growth rate would consume all of that land. That's that 7% buffer. So the difference between that 1.99 and that 2.11 is consuming that 7% buffer that we talked about earlier. Okay? So another way to frame the policy question of the adequacy of employment lands. Okay? And then lastly, I just wanted to hit on a couple of slides. These are really reiterating the points that Scott made earlier. There's challenging access. These are things that help or hinder employment land development. Challenging access, the expensive infrastructure. We used your capital facilities plans for your water, sewer, and transportation. Took some of the expenses up to $2016, and it was about $65 million to do the infrastructure that's needed to serve those areas. Lack of nearby amenities, so there's oftentimes you'll hear of the need for clusters or nearby business services. These are greenfields. There aren't the amenities that other businesses might be looking for when they're looking at location decisions. You'd be looking probably at large facilities, businesses that need large buildings or large tracts of land. Not necessarily the same kind of employment growth that you'll be seeing over the next 20 years. There is the availability of large one-owner tracts, which makes it easier to do large developments to serve large employers. And then the marketability of this land compared to other sites in the region, looking specifically currently at the Camus's North Urban Growth Area or up in North Clark County where they've got good access to I-5 and other transportation corridors. And then lastly, just laying out some alternatives that could be employed to increase capacity, and these could be employed both inside the city as well as inside the UGA. Wetland mitigation, we talked about the port property. There are other areas as well. Minimum floor area ratios, you've used those to some extent. You could use them to a larger degree. Infrastructure investment, you could provide more infrastructure in exchange for density. You've done development agreements in the past. You haven't necessarily included specific density requirements in there, but it would require public investment in infrastructure. You could broker increased density through that mechanism as well. Development incentives, the same kind of thing. Expand mixed-use zoning. So if you've got multifamily zoning property now, if you make that mixed use, there's the potential for it to go either with residential or commercial development or a mix of the two. One thing that some cities have used, and I know it's on your agenda later today, is the multifamily property tax exemption as a way to induce more mixed-use development. So it doesn't have to be applied just to multifamily development. You can develop local criteria that says you need to have some employment associated with that, commercial uses as well. And then transitional zoning. This is an approach that you can use to take an area that you think might be needed for that buffer, and you lay it out now and say it has the ability to transition from residential to employment development over time. So you allow that to happen in a sort of logical way when the demand comes up for that. Okay? So again, Some of these things may be developed more further, in more detail in the next phase of the study if and when you choose to go forward. Okay? So that's it for the presentation. Took a little bit longer than I had anticipated, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what the employment land analysis revealed. And I think, Administrator Scott characterized the three scenarios, and I think he's correct to say that you've got less capacity on the population side than you do on the employment side. And that less capacity on the population side, I think, falls below what you would think normally would be you'd want for a 20-year planning horizon.
So I would just, I think, add at this point in terms of a general broad recommendation from the staff team at this point. As you recall, what we committed to do was to do these first couple of phases of, or first couple of tasks, if you would, with Berger and their team to get to this point, to see what it told us, because these results really are critical to the next steps, depending on where these results were on the spectrum. Could really change what our next steps would be. I think there's one conclusion that's inescapable, and that is we need these urban growth areas to be our urban growth areas. And the decision that brought them into the urban growth area portfolio, when it was made, was wise and had foresight. However, things have changed. We've got a very robust jobs analysis, understanding it's based on the assumptions that it's based on, so always keep that in mind. There's opportunity for adjustments, and in fact, that might be appropriate, that there be some adjustments in terms of what the zoning is, what the comp plan designations are. And so moving forward into the next phases as we work with our consulting team and the community, it's really a chance to look at what are the colors on the map. I always say that. What are the comprehensive plan designations, and how much of that should stay employment or other commercial? Should it convert to something else? Where would that happen? Kind of land on that. Would we do some things inside the city limits that would impact our choices that we would make as a community up there? Stir that all together, and then once we have maps that would come out of that process, then we can look at, okay, how do we specifically want the standards to be in any of the commercial or employment land that would remain in those two areas. I think that's what the council kind of was getting around with some general comments without having this data. You were wondering, wow, is that what we should be doing? Is that what we should be looking at? And this confirms, I think, some suspicions that you had that maybe we have an opportunity to step back and take a look at this, and potentially there are some adjustments. So from our perspective, that's what we need to do next. We need to acknowledge that this is an opportunity to do that and go through a robust process with our consultant to do that visioning work and to come up with some different alternatives and ideas as a community about what we should do in these areas and in the city. That slightly detours, if you would, kind of the way we scoped the original agreement with Berger. The tasks were lined out to end up with employment center standards and not necessarily as much of a dynamic in potentially changing where employment center was, because we just didn't know. Right? We just didn't know what these results would be. We've got scope left to go, which means there's money still left to go in our agreement with them, but we got to kind of tweak the agreement. And I'm not sure what has to come back here in terms of doing that, if there's general consensus here with the council that we should take those steps. If we stay within the same financial arrangement, I have to check with Jen. We may be able to just kind of do that administratively and get back to you when we're ready. We'll let you know about that. But that's our advice and recommendation at this point.
Two questions. One, are you talking about increasing housing and decreasing industrial?
Potentially.
Okay. Second question, how does this affect the Northwest acquisition up there?
Could affect it. It could be the potential for
Difference zoning?
different comprehensive plan designations and different zoning. Of course, we have to work, when I say work with the community, obviously, if you are a property owner, underneath one of those colors on the map, you're a very key individual that we will be discussing this with.
Well, that's my concern. I'm concerned for the property rights, the people that own the property. A lot of those parcels up there were bought as investment property, or for old age building to have a residence up there in a very nice area. And now we're talking about pulling the rug out from under them and saying, hey, well, you will get back to you when you can do that. And I'm not real happy about that.
We're not indicating that. We're just saying we need to, we need to step back and bring our zoning in these areas to be more in line with updated information.
That doesn't tell me anything, so let me ask you a specific question. How long are we talking about?
Our scope goes till the middle of the year. Is that
Well, right, our current scope goes till April, I believe. But I think as part of this reworking of the scope, we would have to extend that time period.
That's not the time frame I'm looking at. What I want to know is, how soon can you tell people up there what they can do and can't do? Property owners.
Well, right now, there's a moratorium in place on the employment center.
And that's 6 months, right?
Right, and that started on Friday. That clock started ticking on Friday, so that's into mid-July.
Are you thinking about extending that?
Not at this point. Not
Okay.
proposing to extend that.
We can go through the planning commission and all, get their recommendations on this and get it all put in place by July.
Well, again, that was part of our original scope that we were working on with Berger, is to develop those employment center regulations. Now, in light of this information, I think that we're at a kind of a fork in the road here about what do we do, and I think it involves more visioning and involving all those people that are colored up there, and still coming out with employment center regulations, because we still need to have those things in place. And we originally, when we scoped that, we did talk about that. We were a little bit less on the visioning work under that scope, because we were really just looking at employment center, and a little heavier on development of the regs. I think now we're probably going to be a little heavier on visioning, but still have to have a decent amount on the regs as well. Yeah, that needs to get done.
How about separating it between commercial, industrial, and residential? Getting the residential done within 6 months, and the rest of it as we can.
Well, I think the problem is that I don't think we know exactly what is going to be residential and what is going to be an employment. I think we're going to see a shift of those colors, and I think what this information at least tells us now is that is
Well,
warranted.
If you want to add to the residential, that's fine.
Well,
What I
that,
want to do is tell the people that we got residential property up there now, what they can do with it. And I don't want to wait more than 6 months to do that.
So that's the moratorium that hasn't been imposed yet.
Right.
There's a proposal to do that, that has a hearing
tonight?
tonight
And
at 7 o'clock.
that's what I saw, and
Right.
I'm really not in favor of that.
Right. I think the findings that you see here would indicate that it would be unlikely at the end conclusion of the community visioning process that your team would be recommending to you a reduction in the amount of residential zoning in the urban growth areas. I think that's an unlikely, and that would be an unwise recommendation coming from us, barring dramatic changes in the way we do residential within the existing city limits for major densification. On the other hand, there have been some conversations at the Community Development Committee level to look at lower density development in some of these areas than is currently assumed. If you did that, given these findings, all of a sudden, we won't have, all else equal, we won't have enough residential land if we did that. So we would have to convert some of the commercial to residential to make up.
So if I
make up for
understand
that.
what you're saying is, there's no possibility that, or very little possibility that you would decrease the amount of residential land up there, but you might increase it.
Yes, that
Okay,
is
so
an
with that
accurate
in
statement.
mind, why can't we, within the next 6 months, tell the folks that already own the property up there, this is what you can do with it?
I think it's a great conversation to have when the moratorium deliberation's going on later this evening. I think that's, defer
I appreciate very much the council's discussion, and we're sort of in an enviable position with respect to having these urban growth areas with capacity. I think 6 months per original work scope is an ample amount of time to engage in the visioning, come up with the alternatives, and if you will, kind of recolor the map or see where things should fall out with all of those stakeholders and partners and owners and community interests. And then maybe it's just a matter of just those implementation steps to really get to where you want to be with certainty, if there is a changing of the zoning up there. So,
I'm with you on wanting to get there.
yes,
My concern is the time that we
Understood.
allow for that.
I do understand.
I'm not so sure though, Dave, that when it's all said and done, and I don't want to speak for the folks that live up there, I think if I were to try and paraphrase what we've heard so far, you would prefer not to see a lot of employment center up there. Would that be correct?
Yes.
And I think that's where you're coming from as well.
Absolutely.
And I believe even if it comes down to, we need an extra month or an extra 2 months, and that's ending up being the goal from what we're seeing here, is that some of that employment center is gonna get reduced, and some of those areas that you would like to develop as residential gets developed as residential, that you might have some patience with us to get to that, if that's the direction we're going, rather than just try and get it done, live with the numbers that we've got now, and leave employment center where it is and figure it out, and you live with what you've got today.
But you can make a decision on what you've got now and add to it later on the residential side.
All the numbers still need to work out, though. That's the rub.
And I just add, one of the things that we did when we looked at the current zoning is you've got some moderate and high density residential up there. You've got some commercial zone land that might not be in the appropriate best location. So there may be some changing of colors on property. So you might, the totals for residential might grow and the totals for employment might decrease, but a
does that
person's
affect the
property might, depending on how the visioning process goes forward, there might be some consideration. One potential outcome would be a relocation of some of that land as well.
But you're not gonna change property designations on what people already own up there.
Yeah. And again, not before you go through a process.
Certainly
We
good.
could.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'd have to go through a
May want
process
to.
to do that.
Paul?
My concern here consistently has been that we not look at single pieces, but we look at an entire city plan. And so I very much want to make sure that we absolutely do incorporate into all of our discussions and planning the Port's Parker's Landing project, the Steigerwald project, the changes that are underway in the planning for the downtown core, both on the part of the property owners, and there's a bunch of moving pieces on transportation also that may end up affecting Steigerwald. And I mean, just one of the really far out possibilities is Camas has got roughly 1,000 acres on the northeast side of Lacamas Lake. If they could get to that by way of Crown Road, that would be a game changer for them up there. And if you draw a line from the turn at Union Street at the storage locker there up to Crown Road, it's not a mile. And so there are some really huge game-changing possibilities that are moving pieces right now. And I just don't want to do it piecemeal. I want to think about all the pieces at once.
And Councilor Greenlee, I think that is a major theme here that we'd like to carry through, is to be able to look at how this decision in these urban growth areas is made with the broader stakeholder in the broader land area, and that the entire city map, if possible, where these adjustments might go.
And just as part of that, I want to observe that I've always thought of my obligations here as being those of a fiduciary, a trustee, for the city as a whole, not any small group of individual members. And so while I do respect individual property rights, those individual property rights are secondary to the greater good.
I hear a lot about the greater good, usually from people who don't necessarily consider the greater good. But what I'm concerned about here is you can spend your life planning. I saw this in the U.S. Army. We used to joke about it. We used to say, ready, aim, 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 aim. And the question was, when are you going to pull the trigger? When are you going to fire? And that's what I'm concerned about here. If you want people to come and invest in your city, you have to have a level of certainty about property rights. And when you say, well, we're going to pull this off the table, pull the rug out from under you, and we're going to do planning ad infinitum until we get it all into one big piece here, people are not going to come and invest their money here. So that's my concern. I want to be able to fire for the property owners up there. And the property owners are not, to my mind, a subset of the entire population. It's a basic fundamental right, the right of contract, the right of ownership of property, and the rights that go with that ownership that have underlain the Constitution of the United States and the way that the government has operated in this country until very recently. And I don't want to throw that out, and we appear to be doing that.
I think we're doing anything but that, but, Joyce?
It's my impression we undertook this study so that we would know what we're doing for the good of the property owners and the city. So I think this is information that we've all felt we needed, that we could begin to make decisions on and give some stability to the property owners up in these areas so that they know what's happening and how it will be developed. That was a big issue last year, of people coming and not knowing what was going to happen and what it meant for an employment center. And so we need this information. That's why we're paying, what, $250,000 to get this information?
Well, the current contract was $225.
So, I mean, thank you. I appreciate being able to see this in a more comprehensive way. And I am sorry if anybody is inconvenienced for this purpose, but I think our council needs more clarity.
How does it provide certainty? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, obviously, we're going to have more of this discussion during the council meeting at 7 o'clock under the moratorium discussion. Are there any other questions right now before we try and get through some more of the workshop agenda?
I had a question of the council, if that's okay. We are at a crossroads here, so or at a fork, really. There's two ways we can go. One way is we have this data, we see what it means. We could say, we'll stand pat with the current comprehensive plan designations in these urban growth areas in the city. There is a place you could find that as the rational approach to take. It's kind of scenario C+, if you would, where job growth is just gonna go nuts, and boy, we're gonna run out of jobs land before we know it, and we're gonna need at least what we already have up there. And we'll work with the consulting team and the community, particularly those most immediately impacted up there, to develop the standards, which is where we called timeout before. That's where we were when we called timeout to do this. The other fork is to say a more reasonable assumption on employment is scenario A or so, scenario B, and in such case, there's an opportunity to reevaluate decisions that were made 10 and more years ago in these UGAs, informed by everything that's going on citywide, which has been informing everything that's been done to date. And so that We don't want that to get lost, and that's a good reminder for all of us, but it is part of that. And that's a little bit different, where we would step back and say, through a visioning process with the community, should we be doing something different up in these areas? And try to get that all done well in time for all of the sort of the thresholds of time that we've already set out. And do our best to achieve that for you. We need to know which fork you want to take. Fork 1 is pretty straightforward. We'll work with those areas and we'll develop employment center standards. I think you're going to hear a lot of concerns from constituents or potential future constituents about that. The other fork is to adjust the scope a little bit within the financial parameters that we have and do the work in these areas and see what it might mean and bring some options back to you.
The indications we have now from the preliminary study is that we are more than likely, the way I read it, going to be designating employment land as residential. We're going to need more residential land and perhaps less employment land. That's what the preliminary numbers show,
To
correct?
stay with scenario A and to B,
So,
that's correct.
And we have an applicant who is interested in developing some residential land up there right now.
Correct.
And the preliminary studies show that we don't have enough residential. They're asking for PUDs and things like that, which I'm a little skeptical of. But, because one of the things I mentioned, I think last time we discussed this, was doing some kind of interim official control instead of a moratorium that would allow them to develop as residential. They wouldn't get the benefit of the PUD. I don't see that as an option here.
Well, tonight at the public hearing, what you have is an ordinance that does a moratorium.
Just a flat-out moratorium.
Flat
So
out.
what could someone who owns residential land do with their land while this moratorium is pending?
They could add to an existing structure, build an accessory building.
Okay, I don't think I can support it.
And that, but what we need is not direct, right now, at this moment, we need direction on this process, not the moratorium.
Oh,
That's-
right.
There's a third option that was just mentioned here, and that's what I'm asking for, is a third option. I'm not, grandfather the people that are up there now in the residential area, do the study. If you want to add to the residential, fine. But grandfather the folks that are up there now, use the process that Brent's talking about. And Brent, thanks for making us aware of that. I wasn't aware of that.
And I think the council would make that decision at the conclusion of the
But,
public
but,
hearing.
but to answer your question now, and we're getting off topic because we got another item to discuss before we finish. I think the approach you're taking as far as the study goes is great. I would support that.
Yeah, I think we need to
Shift gears.
not simply continue the plan that dates back to 2004. It needs revision.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the reasons we looked at this area was due to a lot of questions about infrastructure and compatibility with the land. And so I think we definitely need to continue on that road of looking at designations and what they should be.
Okay.
I think I'm hearing consensus from the council to do that, so we will work. If we have to bring the scope back, we'll do that as an administrative matter with you, but if we're able to make those adjustments because of within the same financial parameters, then we'll do that administratively. And at 7 o'clock, we can talk about the moratorium and what maybe is termed as the third option. That's for decision tonight for the council.
Okay. Well, thank you. Scott, thank you.
Before we get to the next topic, I have some things on Vancouver Council tonight. I'm probably going to miss the first 45 minutes of our meeting tonight.
Okay.
You could miss a lot of it.
Scott,
Yeah.
I don't want you to feel that I'm denigrating the value of your work. I
No.
appreciate it very much.
Not at all. Thank you very much. Thanks for your direction.
Thank you.
Okay, community survey.
Yeah. I will, you had these last time, council, but I'll pass them out again.
Folks, we're going to continue with our meeting. If you've got other discussions, if you could step into the foyer would be great.
So 2 weeks ago, I distributed this copy. This was the 2014 survey, and then I highlighted things red or yellow or green. If they were highlighted red, these are the things we really need to keep the same, because it's what we're going to do to compare ourselves every time we do it. Yellow was an opportunity to maybe change, and green were ones, oh, definitely we can change those. Those were one-off questions that we wanted to ask last time. Ask the council to think about what types of questions you might want to ask. There's room for a couple to a handful of unique questions. One thing is that this process that you've now given us direction on certainly provides a context for asking some questions, and I think that we could come up with a couple questions that would be part of the outreach and the community visioning about these areas. And so I'd kind of like to reserve a couple spots for that, if that makes sense to you, in the survey. But that still gives us some room for a couple of other questions if you would like to ask them. I had heard from Councilmember Lindsay.
Well,
I'd like to keep 15, which is marijuana, and I don't quite know how to ask the question, but one of the things that concerns me as I drive down 205 in Oregon is very prominent public advertising for an age-restricted product. Do we need, should we restrict advertising on, if we do have marijuana retail, should we have restrictions on public advertising of marijuana, alcohol, and tobacco?
So First Amendment, some First
Right.
Amendment issues raised there.
I was going to mention, if we can, we could ask about preferences for doing that. I have,
Just as an aside, several legislators tell me that they are working on bills that would allow those restrictions under Washington law.
okay.
legislative.
I was just asked to look at
Lawyers.
a Ninth Circuit case that struck down some content-based regulations. So,
I'll argue with you about it later.
okay.
But some kind of a question around, so it wasn't so much about should we have it in town at all? It's more about if we do the advertising issue, or are you interested, Councilman, also in the broader question that was asked last time?
The broader question as well. In
Okay.
fact, I think that's maybe even more important than the secondary one.
Okay. So keep that. All right. That is a question that's going to come before the council later in the year,
Yes.
because it's not a moratorium, we need to be careful, it's not a
Sunsets.
moratorium. We prohibited those uses for 2 years, but it sunsets, and Mitch, I don't see.
It's in July, isn't it?
I thought it was
September, October.
Which this will be timely, it'll come well in time for you to do that.
Just tell me when so I can take a vacation around that time.
So, any other burning questions that folks would like to ask?
Well, what do you think about an open-ended question of what do you think the city would most benefit from, or something like that? Just to get an idea of what people would like to have in the city that maybe they don't have.
An open-ended multiple choice?
No, just a blank, fill in the blank.
Can they
Or
do
can
that,
you even
Dave?
do that?
Yes, you can, an open-ended question like that is a one-off, one-time question that you would ask. It's not really for data collection and data
Right.
analysis. It's to just get a pulse in that moment in time.
Yeah,
You might, I think what you're getting at, Counselor, is some sort of community amenity type thing,
yeah,
as opposed to a policy.
right, yeah,
So
yeah.
you could shape it or frame it, if you could name one community amenity that would add the most value, in your opinion, to this
Right.
community, what
Yeah.
would that community amenity be?
That's a good.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Okay,
You knew my, because I'm always barking up that tree when I was thinking of, so,
well, that's
Yeah.
helpful,
Yeah.
because it crosses over part, I mean,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to know that.
yeah.
I mean, I know what I don't get.
I have a question that I'd like on here included. I was over at Jump to Guard Junior High and met with the robotics team, and they want to expand our recycling to plastic bags, and they have a proposal about that. And I suggested, since we're doing this survey, that we could ask the citizens of Washougal if the city wanted to expand the recycling to, for plastic, separating out plastic bags. So something on recycling, if we could bring that in.
You sent me that email.
Did you? Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
So something along the lines of, would you be supportive? You have to describe what it is that would be proposed, and then yes or no, would you be supportive of that? And then a secondary question, would you be willing to pay for that?
Because that would probably be included in their trash pickup, I would assume.
Have to be able to research with Scott and
Yes.
find out.
See if they'd even do it.
I have a question about number 4 and number 5. Do you know why these were what we included last time?
Yes,
Or-
this is the 2014 survey.
Right.
And it was part of, we worked together on this, and it was the first survey. It was to try to get a gauge of the level of community interest and participation of the people that responded to the survey. So one way to measure the level of engagement or participation of a survey respondent is, do you vote? And then also, do you watch our meetings or read our stuff? It's yellow because it's not vital to the survey.
Right.
But for example, I think last time there was some
They're not
interesting-
giving any input about city services through those 2 questions. Those 2 questions are just for our information only.
It was demographics for the profile of those that were responding. For example, on the EMS, the Initiative 502, the $20 TDD fee questions, there was some interest on the council. Were these respondents voters, or were they people that don't participate? So yes, that's why we have more room than just the green, because if we could only replace the green, only 4 could be replaced, but you throw the yellow in, we could do up to 8 questions. Now, we could go a little shorter if we can make it short enough.
Like,
we
I
can
think
save
number
money.
7 is important. Where do you currently get news and information about city programs, services, and events? Because
Yeah.
that helps us figure out where people are getting their information from us.
I like that one too. And 8 goes right along with that.
Yeah.
Paul?
I'm spacing out. I thought I saw somewhere a question about, would you support adding $20 to your license tab to pay for?
16.
16.
16?
The green kind of makes it hard to read, I apologize.
Yeah,
16.
could we reword that a little bit? That seems strained to me. I don't think people understood the question.
Try to get the same type of information, but try to do
Yeah.
a better job of how we pose the question.
Maybe even an opening statement of fact, that streets require maintenance, they deteriorate. How should we pay for it? Would you support?
Oh, we could even throw in, because there are other ways that, this would be a question that you would ask when you put your hats on for being directors of the board of the Transportation Benefit District.
Exactly.
There's the tab fee, there's sales tax, there are different revenue sources. You could ask if there's, any support for any of those types of things, just to give you some feel.
Makes sense to me to
Okay.
ask that.
Or on 16, this is above and beyond the XX amount, it would be for additional,
I'd say instead of
Savings.
new, I'd say an additional.
yeah.
Right. Right, because we spend what we spend, which we've increased, because it's your priority out of that, but I'm getting the feel for that. That would be helpful information for you. I think we can do everything that you've just mentioned within the scope of our size constraints here. my plan with this will be to now, based on this, work with the consultant to come up with a draft and look at what we call a staff final draft at our next meeting and workshop, still informal. There's no action you have to take on the survey, send it out. And then see if there's any more final tweaking that we would want to do. And then we'll start doing the survey with them and have the results to you at your second meeting in May. And then that gives you information for budgeting. That'll start to, now that's about 5 months, February, March, April, May. That's 4 months. Went to engineering school so I could learn how to do this. That's 4 months from now. We have this land use study coming in. We have those land use questions in there. But we get preliminary results before we make the final presentation, so I think it's still helpful. And I would suggest that we push the item that was next. It's a pretty heavy lift until our next meeting.
Rather than get it started.
Do it on February 8th and try not to even do it tonight because we have a public hearing on a moratorium tonight and we have the SR 14 question tonight as well.
On tonight's hearing, and I apologize for having to be late coming back, but this happens when there's a holiday involved and Vancouver's cycle changes of their meetings. But I would really appreciate if we could move the moratorium to the back, because that is a public hearing, and I'd like to be able to vote on that. And if I don't hear the whole testimony of what's discussed, I don't know that I can. The redirection of legislative funds, I think I can, even if I miss some of that, I probably still can vote on that as well, even if I miss part of that. So what I would request is you move the public hearing to the last item.
Okay.
I'll be back as soon as I can.
Okay, with that, we certainly have a few minutes if there are any individuals that would like to comment to council before we adjourn this meeting. We will be, during the 7 o'clock meeting, we will be holding the public hearing on the moratorium, and then most likely also in regards to the SR 14 alternatives. As we get to that discussion, we may ask folks to hold any comments until we get done with those presentations and do it at that time as well, so that they're put together. So, yes.
Well, I had 2 items. I've never been to one of these. I've grown up around here.
Welcome.
Yeah. My first question is, why would you guys support any development north of Highway 14 when you're gonna have a bunch of coal trains that are, none of these throughways, I don't know what you call them, that going over the railroad, they're not gonna be viable. And so I just talked to a guy out here, I guess it was this guy. He's saying these overpasses are gonna cost 50 million right now. That means by the time they're built, they're gonna be 75 to 100 million each. And so, to me, that's the first thing you do. And so you should have a moratorium right now on development. And your contractual rights have nothing to do with it, and your property rights, because you guys have the power to regulate. That's my first comment. My second comment is, I propose that for the bag thing, I spent, because I work for a robotics firm in Portland, and first I'll tell you, they would never invest in Washington. They just wouldn't, in Southern Washington. But what I learned in California when I was down there about the bag thing, all of the cities down there are taxing bags when you make a purchase. And that right there would probably reduce the amount of consumption you have by probably 70%. And they have bag rates between 10 and 25 cents. Now, if you just did 5 cents, you would probably drop, because I live on the Washougal River. There are bags in the river, and you could drop the amount of garbage waste due to the bags just by having a nominal fee at Safeway, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I know it would be, you guys probably wouldn't like that because it's like Portland, kind of a Portlandia thing, although Portland doesn't do it. But it seems to me like the way that I look at the world, why don't you tax a little bit things that you don't want and you untax things that you want? Basically, well, it's called a Pagodian tax. That's all I have to say. I'm for the moratorium, I can guarantee you. I grew up on Mount Norway, and the quality of life around here has dropped so much that it's just shameful.
Thank you. Can Rose get your name so that she's got it for the record in there?
TODD. And then the last name is V as in Victor, ER, D as in David, IER. Thanks for letting me talk.
You bet. Anyone else that would like to make comment to council before we adjourn? Okay, with that, we are adjourned from this meeting then. We'll be back here at 7 o'clock with a number of items to discuss.